So more recently, I've been getting some comments regarding my weathering of my engines and rolling stock and all of my equipment. And to address that comment, I've been wanting to do a video going over my weathering process on all my stuff for the last like 2 months. It's been I wanted to do a video like this for a while, and my plan for this was more or less to have an engine that I have, because I've had a couple engines come through that I've been working on, and I wanted to do basically like a how-to tutorial video on one of those engines. But the thing with me is I get an engine and I get too excited to, I don't know, I just want to get started on it. And so I get an engine in, I do all the work I need to do on it, and I start weathering it. And then by the time I remember to film a video on it, the engine's already halfway complete, or already done a significant amount of weathering on it. So there would be no point from the video. There'd be too much I need to kind of cover. So I had the idea with this engine I just got in to basically weather the whole thing and then talk about each step and how I did it. And it's probably the next best thing. So if you're looking for a weathering video, here it is. I'm sorry it's not exactly what you were hoping for, and it's the same thing for me. It's not what I really wanted to do, but I think this will be a good video that I can that'll be helpful enough and it'll be informative enough. So it should kind of cover that. So this engine here, this is a MTH Berkshire, obviously. This is my 4th scale Berkshire. You know, I think I have enough at this point, but I want some more. Anyway, this is an MTH scale Berkshire that I purchased it off eBay. I got it for a pretty good price, so that's why I picked it up. I'm not a big fan of the MTH Berkshire tooling at all. So I bought it for science, because I wanted to experiment. And I've had this idea for a while to buy an MTH Berkshire, take off all of the, not all of them, but take off a significant portion of the Lionel, or of the MTH parts, like some of the MTH added detailing parts, specifically on the front end, and replace them with Lionel parts. So that's what I did here. This is, again, an MTH Berkshire. The main body is an MTH Berkshire. But on the front end, I replaced the headlight, the Mars light, number boards, the bell, and I also replaced the whistle over there, all with Lionel parts. And then I also did a whole bunch of super detailing. You can see all on the front end, all that extra wiring detail. I also have, I rerouted the whistle cord for some various reasons, for prototype reasons. I have the air line for the bell going back to the cab, renumbered it, and then I, of course, weathered it. And again, I had a plan to kind of show my plans with this engine and how I was going to weather it and show my step-by-step process with it. But I started weathering it today, and I actually weathered the whole thing today. Well, I weathered the whole engine today, so I have to do the tender. But I figured this would be a good, with it just completed and everything fresh in my mind, I could do a quick video just talking about how I did all this weathering and kind of do like a step-by-step without actually doing it, if that makes sense. So I'm sure I've said it multiple times, you've heard me say this multiple times in this channel, but in my opinion, one of the most important things to modeling, weathering, detailing, anything of the sort, the most important aspects you can do to do it well is to research the prototype. And so even though with this engine I have multiple nickel plate engines, multiple nickel plate Berkshires, all that I've weathered, I still wanted to go to prototype pictures of the real engine. This is Nickel Plate Road 718, it's an S1 Berkshire. And when I found a bunch of pictures of the 718, I wanted the pictures that I could find of it from the era I could find of it, because I'm modeling 1957. And I did find photos of the 718 in 1957, but it looks slightly different from this one. Most notably, the white stripe coming down the running board was so dirty on the real prototype that it was just blacked out. It was a solid black engine. And that's fine, but I have 2 other Berkshires that I have weathered, and on both of those I had the black stripe. I had the white stripe. I painted it out to represent one that was where the black stripe was missing. But there's a fair amount of nickel Berkshires that were running around with the white stripe, still partially intact. And I kind of wanted to model, and I wanted to model this engine with the white stripe showing. Now, obviously, even the prototype photos don't show the white stripe, doesn't mean it didn't run without the white stripe. It just depends on when it was taken. There wasn't a person photographing the engine every single day in its operating career to document that. So I took a little bit of, I hate to even say creative liberty, but a little bit of variation from the pictures that I could find to include the white stripe. And I, of course, turned to some prototype photos for that. So here's a picture of the 764, and you can see how the white stripe is, it's kind of there. It's definitely brighter up here than it is going towards the back, towards the cab. It's a lot darker back there. And you can see it's also on the front. And so that was something, I used this picture as a basis, but for the most part with this model. You can see it's pretty close. You can see I tried to get the cleaner, the brighter area up towards the front, like kind of where the step down is. And it's a little bit dirtier towards the back. I have another picture here as well. This one is courtesy of the Nickel Plate Archives. I can't zoom it in. I think my touchscreen will work. There we go. This is of the 716s. This is of an S1 Berkshire. The 764 is an S2. And you can see the white stripe again is it's there. And same thing on the 764. To me, it appears to be a little bit lighter or a little bit brighter up in this area versus back towards the cab and as well as underneath the cab. I don't really know why it's like that, but you know, if I found two pictures like that, I figured that was a good enough basis to get this engine off of. And so yeah, I think prototype pictures are incredibly important, not just for things like a white stripe, just in general to get an overall feel of the engine. Now, I've weathered a bunch of steam engines before. This is like my 8th or 9th nickel plate steam engine that I've owned, that I roster. And, you know, I've weathered a large majority of them. And once you kind of weather, you know, all engines, they were all different, but they were also a lot of the same. They all look pretty similar. I mean, even between these two photos, I mean, I don't know when they were taken. I'm assuming these are both late 50s. Here's the 716 and the 764. You can see they kind of look identical. They're pretty close. And same thing goes with weathering. As long as you can get them, you know, once you weather a handful, it's kind of the same idea. But if you're new to weathering, especially, before you even touch the model with whatever you're going to do it with weathering powder or an airbrush or whatever, I strongly encourage to look through prototype pictures and spend a lot of time looking at prototype pictures, because once you do, you'll kind of see a pattern. You know, for example, I'll bring up the white stripe again. You can kind of see on both pictures how the white stripe was kind of dirtier towards the back of the cab on both engines. So that must mean, I don't know, this was making an assumption that maybe that means that there was something back here that caused it to get a little bit dirtier towards the back of the cab. And that can go for a lot of other things, you know. On every engine I've weathered, I tend to make the firebox in the area around the firebox, if the wheels are on the firebox, lighten them up a little bit to represent sand and ash coming from the firebox and everything. And that's common for every steam engine, every coal-burning steam locomotive. You're always going to see that. So once you look at enough pictures and you look at enough variation of pictures, you can kind of see the patterns as to how engines all kind of weathered very similarly. I can't say that word. And so that's the first basis to being good at weathering. Isn't necessarily just in the technique. Obviously, you have to have a technique that you can perfect and work on. But you also have to have an idea of how things weathered. I've seen so many people, I'm not going to drop names, but there's one famous person, quote-unquote famous person, or well-known person in the O-scale community who is known for weathering, and a lot of stores and even Lionel themselves have contracted this person to do weathering. And truthfully, I don't understand why, because I think his weathering is horrible, and it's very obvious that he's never looked at a prototype picture. At least maybe he has. I don't know what pictures he's looking at, because his weathering, in my opinion, doesn't represent the prototype at all. So it's very important to look at prototype pictures, because I think that is the first step, even before you develop a technique or learn a technique. The first step to being an effective weatherer is to study the prototype and understand how and why engines get dirty. So after I do all my prototype pictures, the next stage that I like to do on the engine is something that I call pre-weathering. And that is basically just involves darkening everything. Well, darkening everything that needs darkened. And this varies depending on a few different factors. Number one, how the engine or how the railroad would have made the engines look, how dirty you want to make it, and that sort of thing. In my case, the nickel plate on all of their steam engines, at least from what I can find, they used a very, very dark graphite on the smoke box and the firebox that was basically black. It looked like it was black. The manufacturers, both Lionel and MTH, on their nickel plate steam engines and their Berkshires included, they tend to come from the factory with the smoke box and the firebox painted a much lighter graphite, like a gray, like a smoke box gray sort of color. And this is how the 765 currently had, well, not currently, but that's how it's appeared like that over the years, many times over the years. And so I'd assume that the manufacturers just kind of base it off of that, but that is not like correct nickel plate practice, at least from photos I could find. They appear to be painted all black. And so the first thing that I did was I just took some apple barrel paint. I used this from Walmart for like 50 cents. I used the satin color, and I pour it in like a Dixie cup. I thin it with water, so it kind of makes like a milk-like consistency. And I brush paint the smoke box and the firebox, which is multiple thin coats. And if you see my 759 video, I've talked about it there. But I just do multiple thin coats to get it black. I just start it black. And it doesn't have to be like the greatest paint job ever. If there's blotches or something, that's okay, because it gets all covered up with the weathering. So that's for nickel plate. Obviously, if you're modeling a different railroad, you don't necessarily have to do that, but I do it just so it's accurate from the nickel plate. And then after that, I like to go through, and anything that is shiny, I paint with a flat black. So I use the satin black for the smoke box and the firebox for most things. And then I use jet black, which is like a flat black, and I use that on everything such as the running gear. So all the rods I paint with this flat black. On this model, they were darkened as is, but they kind of had like reflective properties, I guess. And I mean, I've seen pictures where they kind of look like they look stock, but I personally like the look where they're all flat and they kind of like create kind of like that matte look overall. So I like to paint all of the running gear black. I also paint the bell black. Well, not in this case, but sometimes I'll paint the bell black. I paint the whistle. Oh, my shadow's in the way. I paint the whistle that flat back. I also paint the pop-off valves flat back as well. So basically anything that's shiny, I like to paint black. And again, you don't necessarily have to do this. I've seen plenty of pictures and other cases where they stay shiny, but I like to paint the black. I just think it creates just more of a hunker down and everything just kind of looks more uniform that way. So once the pre-weathering is complete, I take the engine out and I clear coat it. I don't have it in here, it's not on my workbench right now. I just use a Krylon rattle can for a clear coat. I just give the engine just a base clear coat, and that's for two things. Number one is to seal any of the paint I did before, like on the smoke box and the fire box and all of the running gear and such. I like to give it just to kind of give that a quick sealant so it doesn't wear off. Sometimes it still will wear off, but I just feel like it'll help prevent it. Of course, masking where necessary. On this one, I only masked the Mars Light lens and I masked the cab windows, and I mask them for the clear coat. I don't mask them for anything with the weathering, so I don't use an airbrush. I don't have to worry about that. But I mask what I need to mask for the clear coat. And then I bring it back inside and I start into the bulk of the weathering, which is all done with weathering powders. And the base weathering powder, the first thing I do with the weathering powder is I just cover the whole engine in either grimy black or dark gray weathering powder. Now I'm using powders here made by Monroe Models. These are called AIM weathering powders. And I've used a variety of weathering powders throughout different projects, and I find these are the best. I just think they grip the best. I like the colors the best. So I like to use either dark gray or grimy black, or sometimes both. For this one, I used dark gray, excuse me, because you can see I'm out of grimy black, but I still have a fair amount of dark gray left. Now, even though they are listed as two different shades, to my eye, and I'm sure to most other people's eyes, they look identical to me. So, and I've used, like, this is a dark gray with all the, the main base is dark gray. Other engines I've used grimy black on, and you really can't even tell the difference. They look identical. So I need to get some more grimy black, but the dark gray is a perfect substitute. Doesn't really make a big difference. So when I apply the weathering powder, I just use this brush. I got it, I don't know, my local hobby store maybe, but you can find something similar like at Michael's or Joann Fabrics, I would assume. I call it a horsehair brush. I don't know the technical name of it, or what the official name of this brush is called. But I like it because it's kind of like the bristles on here are kind of loose and they're kind of spread out. So you can really dip it in the weathering powder and just kind of brush it on, and it really spreads it pretty far. It's not like everything is kind of loosely held onto the bristles. So it's not you can just kind of dip it in and brush it on, and it spreads it pretty far, versus something with more finer and stiff bristles. Anyway, I'll take either my dark gray, grimy black, and I'll do the whole engine. That includes the top, the boiler, the smoke box, the cab, the whole top of everything, and then just as importantly, the underside. And that includes, obviously, the firebox, the wheels, and the cylinders and everything. But something that is imperative to get, I can turn my light on in here and see if you can see it a little better. But it is imperative to get underneath the boiler as well. You can kind of see there how I got underneath all the boiler. Some of my earlier weathering, I wouldn't do that, and it looks fine when it looks fine, at the start. Once you're running the engine and you're kind of looking back over your work, it is very noticeable where you don't do that because everything is shiny. It's kind of like like that shiny plastic look. It doesn't look nearly as good, or it's very noticeable. So and that's of course going to be like one of the dirtiest parts of the engines, under the boiler where all the road grime is going to kick up and such. So it's imperative to get that, honestly, just as much, if not more, than getting everything else on the engine. So make sure you don't forget any of that area. But I like to do the whole engine in that color, the whole thing, and then I take it back out for another clear coat, and then we move on from there. So with all of the base weathering complete, the next step that I like to do is a little bit of dry brushing, primarily around the wheels. And for that, I just take like a stiff bristled brush. I don't really have an example to show, but because I have a whole bunch of different brushes that I use. But anything with like a stiff bristle, then I take some of my just cheap acrylic. This is some white paint, and I dry brush all around the wheels. And I do this because, and I talked about this just a minute ago in the video, is you see a lot of times in pictures, specifically of in-service pictures, and even on some engines that are in excursion service that have, aren't kept totally clean, you'll see, I would assume it's from either the sand or something from like the ash or something from the firebox, or a combination of both. But usually the rearmost driver, like this, the rearmost or the second two drivers towards the rear, will typically end up being slightly lighter than the ones up towards the front, as well as anything around this area, like underneath the firebox. And I guess, like I said, I think it's from sand or ash or something, but it tends to usually be slightly lighter. So what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of that white paint and I'll do the whole wheel in white, dry brush it white. So it's actually like almost jarringly, jarringly bright. And then I'll take some more of that grimy black or dark gray weathering powder and I'll brush it on. And it creates a nice effect where it's real subtle, but you can see, I don't know if it really shows up well in the camera, but the rearmost driving wheels are just slightly lighter than the ones towards the front. It's a really nice effect, real subtle. And then I'll touch it up as well using some dirty white weathering powder, and it's kind of like that, it's like a dirty white color. And I'll also just kind of give a few passes of that over all the drivers, one towards the front as well as towards the back. And I just find it creates a very nice slight variation. Well, I have the lighter colors out, like the dirty white, as well as more of a whitish color, which again, I'm out of. I don't have any of that left, so I need to go get some more of that. But it's really any kind of lighter colors, like any kind of white color. I'll use that around, basically around the whole underside of the engine. So like on the firebox, on the rearmost, on the trailing truck, obviously on the wheels, like I said. It's a good spot to put it up on the cylinders as well as anywhere around like the front pilot. Just to use that lighter color because, the engines are usually an in-service steam engine is overwhelmingly black with the soot and cinders and such, but it's still running on the railroad. And, back then with the type of ballast they were using and they had, things got dirty, and they got dirty in a slightly different way than they did today, just because of the different style of ballast and such. But of course, everything, on the underside of the engine will get dirty just from road grime, in addition to the cinders and, the other, reasons for being a steam engine. So I use either like a little bit of dirty white as well as just like a regular white and like a light gray, any kind of colors. For this one I use primarily dirty white, but that varies with what I have on hand and what prototype picture. So but in this one I just took a little bit of that dirty white and just gave a few hits of it, again towards the back, on the cylinders, up around the pilot area. And because it just kind of creates, again, it's all about variation. You don't want everything to be one solid color, because then that'll look just as bad as it, as a poor weathering job. It has to be subtle. It can't necessarily draw attention to it with it being so jarring, but it has to blend in nicely. It's all about blending. One unique thing I did on the front end of this engine is you'll notice I left the front, or the smoke box front, actually pretty much untouched. And I did that on purpose. I found a lot of photos of nickel plate Berks, and actually some of the 718 like this, but of a whole bunch of them, where they must have just sprayed down, or I guess they would have sprayed down the front of it, like the front of the smoke box, and that was it. Because there's a lot of pictures where the whole engine is pretty much dirty, including the front, the lower area, like where the pump shields are and the pilot and such. But then the smoke box front itself is kept relatively clean. Like it's like a noticeably cleaner than the rest of the engine. So I wanted to model that, and all I did, I just didn't use any weathering powder on the front end here. You'll see there's a little bit like up around the bell and on the extra flags and such, but the majority of it here is kept pretty clean. So again, it's all about prototype pictures and looking closely and studying them and just going off of that. Prototype pictures are like a roadmap. Weathering is a lot easier when you have something that you can kind of copy off of. So with all of that done, really the last thing there is to do is a little bit more dry brushing, primarily on the boiler to represent a little bit of boiler streaking. You can see up here I did some coming down from the turret valve, as well as a little bit coming from some washout plugs. In fact, I'm gonna fix that. I don't really like how that looks. But you can see some coming down from the washout plugs and the turret valve, just some white boiler streaking. And again, I did that with just a really old beater brush, and then this cheap white acrylic paint, same thing I did on the drive wheels. And it's just real subtle. Again, going off prototype photos. And anywhere where I think it's a little bit too light, it's too white, or it's too noticeable, I'll take a little bit of black weathering powder and just hit it real quick there. That tends to tone it down. In fact, I think it actually toned it down a little bit too much here, like where the turret valve is. But I think it's fine. I can live with it. You see, I have some as well on the firebox. And then also up here at the front, under where the stack is, I did the same technique. I just used the jet black, the flat black paint, and represented just some soot coming down from the smokestack. Again, it's not rocket science. It's real simple techniques, and it really just, you know, again, following prototype pictures, it really creates a pretty nice effect. One thing I like to do on these steam engines where there is a scale coupler, notice how I said scale couplers, I'll take some acrylic brown paint. I don't have it out, but it's like, I believe the color is chocolate. And I like to paint the dummy scale coupler on the front. You look at a lot of pictures of these, it tends to be, it's like a rusty, you know, like a rusty coupler color. Now, I only do this on the scale coupler in the front. I do not do this on the, you know, the big dummy O-gauge coupler on the back of the tender, or like when I weather freight cars. I never ever paint or weather the couplers, because O-gauge couplers are much larger than O-scale couplers, and O-scale couplers, this is the correct size for an O-scale coupler. A 3-rail O-gauge coupler is gigantically oversized, and personally, I don't think they look too bad when they're not weathered and they just kind of stay black. But once you paint them and you weather them and you make them brown, it just draws more attention to them, and to me, it just makes it stand out like a sore thumb. So I only ever do this technique or this effect on the scale couplers on an engine, whether it's on a steam engine or the front of a diesel engine or something, only on scale couplers. I highly advise against doing it on a lobster claw O-gauge coupler. And really with that, it's just one more final clear coat, actually maybe a few more clear coats to seal everything up. And it's pretty much done, and it's just a matter of, you know, cleaning the wheels, cleaning the pickup rollers, and pulling the masking tape off, and you're pretty much good to go. So this weathering really isn't rocket science, but I know it is, you know, it might be a little bit of an unconventional technique compared to some other people, you know, what the other people do. I feel like the overwhelming majority of people in the hobby, whether it's O-scale or any other scale, tend to use an airbrush. And I don't use an airbrush for a few reasons. Number one, I actually own an airbrush, and for the longest time, I was kind of afraid to use it. I take it back. I wasn't afraid to use it. It was more a sense of me being too lazy to use it, because I know using an airbrush, I thought required a lot of cleaning and stuff. And it's not that much work, but it's just something I really didn't want to have, so I didn't really want to deal with. My friend recently got an airbrush, and I had the chance to try it out, weathering a freight car on it. And well, I didn't think it was that bad. It was definitely a lot easier than I anticipated. There's a lot of things I didn't like about it. The main thing being is that it was kind of hard to get accuracy with an airbrush. You know, it was hard to get exactly in one area. And obviously that takes practice. My first time doing it, so I can't expect to be, you know, really good at it in the first try. But that was something that I took note of. And, you know, aside from that, I like the airbrush, and I understand why people use it. I think it gives good results. It's really not that hard to do with a lot of practice, and it's pretty simple to work with. Again, I don't use an airbrush, again, for the reason that I was kind of grandfathered into not using an airbrush. I started weathering before I really used an airbrush, or was kind of open to using an airbrush. So I like this technique because that's just what I'm used to, and at this point I've done like 7 engines with this technique, so I'm not really willing to change it, because the weathering powder technique and the airbrush technique look very different. And so if I were to just, after doing, I think it's like 7 engines I've done now with this weathering powder technique, and then switching to an airbrush, it would look drastically different, and I just don't think they would blend well together. I do like the weathering powder technique for a couple of reasons. The primary reason being is that it conveys texture. When you apply weathering powder, you're literally applying texture to the engine. This isn't paint, it's all powder. And when you look at an engine in real life, you look at a picture of an engine in real life, you look at a picture of a real life engine, or you go see a steam engine in real life, a dirty engine, you can see that it's obviously the dirtiness. It's not paint. It is texture. It's soot, and it's cinders, and it's road grime. It's all dirt. And so this, in my opinion, is the closest technique to modeling the real life. It's basically the same technique. It's basically the same process as to what happens on the real thing, except obviously here it's being done artificially versus, you know, natural. So I like that a lot. I mean, when you compare my weathering, in my opinion, when you, in my opinion, compare this weathering of this technique of an engine of mine to a prototype picture, it looks pretty spot on. Like, it looks almost exactly right. So I like that a lot. I also find it pretty easy to work with. I mean, as I demonstrated, applying weathering powder is literally taking a good brush and just going on there, making sure you cover everything. Doesn't require layers, doesn't require to thin it out or anything. It's very simple to apply, and it's really not a lot of work. So for those reasons, I really like using weathering powder. However, there is a couple drawbacks. The number one drawback, in my opinion, is the durability. Weathering powder, no matter how many times you try and seal it with clear coat, it's going to get everywhere. And so you can even see, after handling the engine a little bit here in between, moving the engine around and stuff, you can see my hands are a little bit dirty. And this is with multiple amounts of clear coat on them, on the model. For me, I don't really care. It doesn't really bother me that much. You know, I try and pick the engine up in a specific area, kind of like here. It's like my pickup area to get it. But if you want to flip the engine over or something, you know, to maybe do maintenance on it or something, I mean, you can do it, but there is the risk of either damaging the weathering or getting your hands dirty. I mean, I don't really care. It's not that hard to touch up the weathering, and I don't really handle my engines that much or really take them apart ever. So it's not really a big deal to me. But if you're someone who likes to pick their engines up on and off the layout quite a bit and is just kind of picky about, or it just doesn't really have the patience to be real careful with your models, and this might not be a good weathering technique to do. You might want to look into airbrushing or something. So that, in my opinion, is really the absolute biggest, and I think, in my opinion, it's the only drawback really of this technique is the durability, and that just comes down to what you want to do with it. If you know, if you're okay with it, then I would highly recommend this technique. Otherwise, you know, let me look into using an airbrush or applying some paints or something on it. But I think it's pretty good. I think it's pretty true to the prototype. You know, I've done a large majority of my engines I've weathered this way. A lot of my steam engines I've weathered this way. I intend to continue weathering engines this way. I don't really have any plans to change my technique. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with this engine and this, you know, how the weathering job came out. If there's like the biggest takeaways from this video, it is that, well, the biggest takeaway that I would like, you know, anybody who's watching this who's interested in weathering things for themselves is look at prototype pictures. I can't stress that enough. You know, you may think you know how an engine weathers, and maybe you do, but it's always good to look at prototype pictures just to understand how an engine gets dirty, and also use kind of a roadmap. You know, if you're new to weathering and you don't really know where to start, look at a picture and just emulate that, you know. So I'd highly recommend doing things like that. Prototype pictures are great. If you can combine prototype photos with this technique, and I think you'll have some pretty nice models. So anyway, thanks for watching. I have some more stuff coming soon, but I hope this is a good substitute for the weathering video that I was supposed to do. I'm pretty happy. I'm pretty happy with how this came out, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.